Welcome along to Operationalising Participatory Grantmaking, which I think is a real word, but my Google spell check really doesn't like when I try and spell it, so I may have made it up, but we're going to go with it because I think it summarises what we're covering in this session today. So, as some of you may or may not know, if you've been along to any of the other learning sessions, this is the final one of 6 learning sessions. Thank you everybody who's joined us on the whole journey. It's been a whirlwind. We are developing a movement of people who are interested in participatory grant making. So if you are the autocorrect just corrected that as participatory grant making, which I'm down for. If you are interested in being part of the movement, please do tweet. We're using the hashtag participatory grant making and shift the power. And if you caps locks the first letter of each of those words as you use them as hashtags, it makes them much easier to understand what people are talking about. I tweet predominantly about participatory grant making, occasionally some disability politics in there. So if you're interested in any of that, please do follow me on Twitter. And I now blog about participatory grant making on Medium if you are interested in that. All of these learning sessions are on the back of me being very lucky and being able to do a Churchill Fellowship around participatory grant making. And that enabled me in 2019 to travel to South Africa to spend time with the other foundation and to the USA to spend time with lots of different organizations. I was counting them earlier, 42 different organizations across America to hear from their best practice. And on the back of that, I have written a report called Grassroots Grantmaking, Embedding Participatory Approaches in Funding. And this series of events is part of launching that report. And I will share the website that you can access that if you'd like to read it. I've tried to written it. Oh dear. I've tried to write it so that it is not and it's not a chunky thing. I mean, it is a chunky thing, but you can pick the bits that you're interested in, so you don't have to read the whole thing, because I'm not a report reader. I like to keep it short and sweet. So hopefully that is helpful for you in the work that you're doing. On the back of all of this as well, we have developed a community of practice around participatory grant making. We started in March at the beginning of the lockdown, and I think we're now at about 250 members, which I think is pretty good going, and demonstrates kind of the strength of passion and feeling and excitement in this space. So if you are interested in getting involved, we're a great bunch, we're all very friendly, it's very informal, much like this. You can join us online. We've got a Slack group and we meet every month to unpick a different issue or explore or make friends or kind of develop networks and contacts. So if you're interested in that, please do let me know. So today is all about operationalising participatory grant making. We're joined by 3 incredible speakers today. I'm very, very excited. Khadra is from Camden Giving, which is a small locally based funder in Camden, which is a borough in London, UK. And Khadra does some incredible work doing all of the support around their decision makers, amongst lots of other things, but should be particularly focusing on how do we build that into the operationalising, I don't know if that's operationalising, the way that we do participatory grant making. So I'm very excited for that. Coco is from Mama Cash, which we were chatting just before this started, and I was like, Mama Cash is where everybody wants to be. It's the cool grant maker, and there are lots of cool grant makers, don't get me wrong, but Mama Cash is one of them, an incredible feminist fund who have managed to pivot this year all of their funding to be participatory. So definitely one to explore and watch for lots of us on the call who are looking at how to embed this within their organisations, particularly if you weren't set up as a participatory grant making organisation to begin with. And then finally, Yvonne. So Yvonne is an old colleague of mine. She used to work at the National Lottery Community Fund, which, if you do know us, or if you don't know us, we're quite a large bureaucratic organisation in the UK. We're governed by law, by the government, because it is public money. So it's quite an interesting organisation to work in. Yvonne then left to go and start an incredible travel business. So if you ever want a holiday, Yvonne's your person to talk to. But she also did that at the beginning of Corona. So on the side, has done some consultancy work that has enabled her to look at how the British Science Association can embed participatory approaches into its work, which again is a really interesting foundation and one that you wouldn't necessarily connect with participatory grantmaking. But she'll be telling us all about how she took operationalising stuff from National Lottery Community Fund and various other aspects of her life and embedded that into the new Ideas Fund for the British Science Association. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Khadra, who is going to kick us off.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, please, may I have screen sharing?
I will share. Hang on. I'll stop doing the wrong things. Right. Okay. Yeah. And let me see. Or do you want me to share it? Is that easier?
Yeah, that works as well.
Okay. Can you people see that still?
I can't see a screen.
That better?
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. As Hannah has said, my name is Khadra and I work at Camden Giving. We're a place-based funder and we're part of a wider London Givings movement. We've used participatory grant-making since the beginning of our journey. Luckily, we didn't have to get our board on board, as in fact, they were the ones who decided to devolve decision-making power to local residents. The driver behind this decision was because we believe that people living in Camden and who are often the ones experiencing the inequalities that we're trying to tackle should be the ones who decide where funding goes. Next slide, please. I'll now share some of the nuts and bolts of delivering participatory grant making. The first step, after we've secured a donation to develop a fund programme, is to recruit local residents to sit on the panel. This is pretty straightforward. We develop a job description, advertise on our website and on social media. Initially, we requested CVs and cover letters, but we soon realised this was replicating inaccessible recruitment practices, and we were not receiving applications from a broad range of community members. So we adapted our process slightly. We now have a very simple form on Typeform with just one question, asking applicants to demonstrate their knowledge of inequality that exists in Camden. Another change to our process is utilising our partners to spread the word. For example, when we're recruiting young grant makers, we make sure to alert all the youth groups in Camden about the opportunity and have in the past allowed youth workers to attend the interview with the young candidates to make them feel more at ease. We often get asked about payments. How do we pay our panellists? So we pay them a London living wage of £10.85 per hour. We pay them as research volunteers. That helps us with, HMRC and tax and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes you'll need to provide additional support regarding these payments. If people are in receipt of state benefits, then you might need to refer panellists to advice services or local partners who can help them navigate that issue. Next slide, please, Hannah. Right, so once we've recruited the panel, what do we do next? So we usually provide panellists training. We train them over 4 to 6 sessions. This is an opportunity to provide them information about how funding works and insights into the voluntary sector. We then move on to co-designing the fund criteria with the panel, and the panel decide what type of questions to ask in the application form. Again, this is a pretty straightforward process. However, there is additional wraparound support that you might need to offer. Firstly, are you covering any expenses which allow the panellists to attend the session? Before COVID, this would include things like travel expenses and childcare. Since the pandemic started, we moved all our sessions online. We realised that a lot of people were experiencing what we call the digital divide, and we've been able to reallocate some of our budgets to help people overcome obstacles like this, such as providing access to tablets and Wi-Fi to those who need it. Something I think is integral to this type of work is flexibility. Have you done everything you can to ensure people are still able to take part in the sessions and the overall process? For example, we don't penalise panellists for missing sessions. Instead, we follow up with one-to-one sessions so they don't miss any vital information. We ask people to never apologise for surprise appearances from kids and pets and try our best to make them as comfortable as possible. In fact, just the other day, we had someone join a training session as she cooked a dinner for her toddler. We felt really happy that she felt comfortable enough to do this, and we're also obviously very impressed by her multitasking skills. Next slide, please, Hannah. Once panelists have completed their training, they reconvene for a panel meeting where they decide who to award the grants to. The duration of the panel role can last from 3 months to 3 years. And when the fund programme comes to an end, we always are really sad to say goodbye. However, we work really hard to ensure that people can access other opportunities, whether that's with Camden Giving or with our employment and training partners in Camden. To date, we've had panelists join our board, our team, and even start their own funded projects. This is just a really brief insight into some of the work we do and the additional things you need to think about when working with community members. I'm happy to answer any questions and provide even more detailed information. But back to you, Hannah, for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Khadra, that was amazing. I felt a little bit like Boris Johnson. If anybody is from the UK, they do their press releases and they haven't worked out giving him a clicky thing for the presentation. So continuously he has to ask, next slide, please, next slide, please. So Yvonne, when you come to your slides, I've given you co-hosting rights so that you can do your own slides and you don't have to continuously rely on me to press the button. I'm going to pass over to Coco now, who's going to take us through Mama Cash's work.
Thank you, Hannah. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hannah, for organizing this session and for all the attendees for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen and participate. My name is Coco Jervis, as Hannah said. I'm the grants manager for Mama Cash. For those of you who don't know, Mama Cash is the world's oldest international women's fund. We've been in existence since 1983, based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Mama Cash provides long-term, up to 10 years, flexible core support grants to approximately 150 women, girls, trans, and intersex rights groups around the world that are working to advocate and defend and to change the world. So Mama Cash has been very excited to announce that starting this year, we are transitioning into a fully participatory grant maker. And for us, this means that we are committed to shifting the decision-making power about which groups our grants get from our staff to the communities that we aim to serve. As a philanthropic organization that provides, as I mentioned, flexible core long-term support, we have been very cognizant of the reality that many of our actions and decisions regarding the raising and redistribution of funds, on one hand, challenges inequality and injustice, but on the other hand, perpetuates some of the structural forces and power dynamics that keep people oppressed. So in recognition of that duality, we have committed ourselves to taking this action, not just in a performative way, but substantively as well. So in small ways, we just want to disrupt this sort of secretive and insular power dynamic of controlling who gets funded and who makes decisions by leaving it to the communities to set our priorities within our feminist landscape. And now we recognize that just because we are transitioning into a participatory grant maker, that in of itself is not enough. It's not a magic bullet. It does not disrupt entrenched power dynamics. But what it is for us at Mama Cash is just one step in the right direction that over time we hope will help us share power and create more transparency and accountability towards the movements and communities that we aim to serve. Our transition is more of a returning to our roots. So it's more of an evolution than a revolution. The ethos of sharing power has long been present throughout the history of Mama Cash. Our organization was born from feminist movements and activists in 1983. In our early years as a funder, decisions about who got our grants was grounded in the movements. We had no paid staff. The activists themselves were making decisions about grants. But as we professionalized, as we grew as an organization, we and as we got more international donor support, we were able to scale up our impact globally. But that has meant that as the staff has joined, although they have often come from movements, the decisions of the grants were made wholly by staff for the last 15 or so years. So now we're kind of going back to where we started, and by shifting our decision-making power. And so it's something that we are all excited to do because it feels like we were becoming more of the organization that we started off when it was first created. So as far as we know, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I hope I am, but Mama Cash is the only funder of its size with its depth of thematic areas and breadth of geographic diversity that has attempted to transition grant making into a participatory approach. Our transition hasn't been multi-step, inspired by the International Trans Fund, UHI, Frida, the Red Umbrella Fund, which is a sex worker donor collective here in the Netherlands. We started a couple of years back by building and testing smaller pots of money in a participatory grant making approach. We had a small scale Spark Fund for feminist initiatives based here in the Netherlands. And then most recently, we created the Solidarity Fund with, for, and by other peer women's funds. And after successfully carrying out these little pilots, we felt we were ready to transition the remainder of our grant making portfolio in a participatory approach. So how we did this. So it's been about 18 months that we've been researching, information gathering, consulting, facilitating dialogue, and decision-making about its transition. We spoke to a number of different participatory funders to seek their input and advice, collect feedback. We dialogued with our external stakeholders, including our long-term grantee partners, board members, allies, external advisors. Then we spent a lot of time having internal discussions and deliberations to ensure that the values of power sharing and transparency became embedded across all of the ways of our working. We also spent a lot of time weighing all the assorted risks of auditors, restricted funding, due diligence, reporting requirements, amongst others. And then late last year, we decided on a participatory model to implement, which is our own sort of design. It's a two-step model wherein we will seek input and in priority settings from all of our applicants when they apply. And then we'll have a community advisory panel, which will make the final decision-making for all new groups starting from this year onwards. And just to give a little sense, we have an open window. This year will be from March 1st to March 31st. We get on average around 1,500 or so applications. And of that, we usually make about 1.2 to 1.5% so it's a very competitive process. So we make about 20 grants per year. And as I mentioned, these are core long-term support. Our commitment is up to 10 years. And so it's a very competitive process to get on my cash grant. I want to underscore that getting to this point has not been linear or easy at times. It has required a lot of time, a lot of resources. It has most importantly required a lot of strong leadership from the top level. And it has required what I would say is sort of an internal excavation. It has required changing of staff roles, changing processes and plans, has a lot of administrative work that it's required. And so it has been a very, very, at times, challenging process for us to go through, but we have been really greatly encouraged by the support and enthusiasm that we have received from the community. So I want to leave you with sort of 4 takeaway lessons that we've learned through this process. The first one, and the process, as I mentioned, is we're about to launch it. So we will, I'm sure, if you talk to me a year from now, talk about all of the, challenges that were unexpected or the messes that we had to clean up. Hopefully there'll be some successes, but we are committed to being very transparent and public as we sort of go through this process. But so one of the first lessons that I'd say is that don't recreate the wheel. There's just diverse community of practice of participatory grant makers that we can learn from. Hannah mentioned the participatory practitioners group. What do you call that? The community of practice group. Is that right? Yes. And I really encourage folks to join it, even if you're have not yet stepped your foot into doing participatory grant making. I think there's so much to learn from those who are in different parts of that life cycle. I would say start small as well. Our transition has been multi-step. We started a couple of years back. We tested smaller pots. I think that was really great to sensitizing, especially board members, about how this can work and to allay some fears, especially amongst our donors. Be willing to take risks. In order to become a participatory grant maker, your organization needs to increase its risk appetite and has to have a clear vision and commitment to disrupting traditional power dynamics and sharing power. And then finally, I would say share what you have learned, the good, the bad, the ugly, share, because we hope that by sharing our journey, it will spur other funders to consider transitioning into participatory grant makers, and also other funders who are looking to support other groups that are willing to take this risk as well. And it hopefully will encourage folks to create more equitable partnerships. So let me end by saying that becoming a participatory grant maker is an ongoing process of disruption, development, learning, risk-taking, problem solving, sharing, and shifting power. But I think it is all worth it, and it's been a really great journey so far. Thank you.
Thanks, Coco. That was really good. I'm going to pass over to Yvonne, and having said that she'll share the slides, I'm now going to share the slides so she can actually see her notes. So bear with me 2 seconds.
Thank you, Hannah. There's not too many in there. And I'm thinking, I'm not too sure how much the slides add to what I'm going to say, but here we go. So thanks very much, Hannah, for inviting me along. As Hannah mentioned, we work together at the National Lottery Community Fund. So as you can imagine, quite a traditional funder whenever it comes to its approach to operationalising grant making. It's ahead of the curve in some areas, but other areas definitely trying to catch up. We were working on a program that was largely centralized, kind of rolling program. So they weren't necessarily lots of kind of open and closed dates. I moved from there to the British Science Association. So they got funding from Wellcome, who were really interested in trying to fund public engagement with health in a bit of a different way. So trying to get closer to communities and trying to reach what they would call underserved communities in health research. So BSA have a really good, strong track record in terms of community engagement, and BSA seemed like a good option to try and do something a bit different with the existing public engagement fund at Wellcome. So we went through a co-design program and developed a really interesting fund. So I don't know how many people on the call are familiar with funding for public engagement, especially in health research, but this does feel very different from some of the other things that we've come across within that space. So ultimately, we were looking to reach new audiences with this, and therefore doing things differently was really important, and that included operationalizing it differently. So I'm not going to go into the mechanics of the participatory grant making. I think you're kind of experts kind of around that in your own right. So this is really just some insights into what the operations look like differently compared to a big funder like National Lottery, compared to a small funder and participatory approaches within BSA. So the Ideas Fund, it was launched yesterday, I'm really pleased to say, and I think I've got a couple of colleagues on the line here as well who have taken that forward. I left at Christmas time, so I'm thankful to them and grateful to them that it's actually gone according to plan so far in the day or so it's been launched. So the first slide where I want to kind of talk about the staffing model. So Hannah and other members of my team will let you know that I was a slave to a Excel spreadsheet trying to model the life out of what would a staff model look like for our team within the National Lottery Community Fund. So whenever you look at a participatory grant making, it will look different. So what we were kind of looking at here was, thinking about a centralized traditional grants team within the National Lottery compared to something that's going to be very locally based. So the co-design of the funding program led us down a route of place-based funding and participatory grant making. But basically, the grants team that we're looking at for the Ideas Fund that we have in place is a bit of a mix of a central grants team, but that central grants team are kind of very much I suppose they're kind of like a facilitative role that are kind of leading the program, but it's actually also having a mix of roles that are out within those specific places as well, doing development coordination work. So the development coordinators play a very different role to what we typically would have seen within our grants team at the National Lottery. Very much about kind of outreach, very supporting, questioning, coaching, and connecting potential applicants with others. So if we're trying to reach new audiences, we needed to do things differently, and this was our way to do this. So within what we were kind of trying to do, like most kind of participatory grant making, you're trying to disrupt those kind of power imbalances. And really, we kind of thought to reflect what the aims of the funding program is trying to achieve, we needed to also reflect that within our staff and makeup as well. So the question was, how do we then having contracts with development coordinators out in the local communities who are not actually our staff. They're working on a contract to us. How do we ensure that there's some sense of consistency, and how do we not just kind of replicate traditional kind of power dynamics in contract and relationships as well? So we are looking at putting in place a set of support, which will include a series of reflection, connecting, learning and support spaces for the development coordinators, rather than that traditional line management type of relationship that you would normally have. So the development coordinators, actually, I think they sound like a great job, actually. I would love to do them. It's very much actually about out there supporting, helping people with their ideas, and it's not about going out and assessing and saying this is good and this is bad. They can play a real, I suppose, impartial type of a role whenever kind of people come to them. Obviously, they'll be thinking about the criteria and supporting people to kind of think of if this funding program's for them. But actually, it puts them in a bit of a different position. People are coming to them as a development coordinator, not as the funder, and we're hoping that will form a bit of a different relationship, and we will see hopefully different types of proposals coming forward. In terms of what that looks like, though, in terms of the actual kind of resource you need to do that. So normally, in a traditional sense, at the National Lottery, I would have started with, okay, so what are we kind of expecting in terms of kind of the modelling, kind of what kind of numbers, how can we support the assessment to run that, and building that up the ways. However, with this, we have a specific budget. We don't have the, I suppose, the budget of a big organization behind us. We've got a very particular budget to operationalize this type of a program. So what we tried to kind of start working out was, what kind of staff we could afford that would help us deliver the type of model, that outreach model that we wanted. And then started to thinking about, well, actually, if that's what we have in place, what are the numbers of grants that we could support and manage to help get into our pipeline in order to achieve the, I suppose, the theory of change and test out some of the principles that we wanted to understand as part of this funding. So there was something about what would be manageable, and therefore how many applications might feel comfortable for us to manage in this more supported way. So it was very strange, actually. We looked at it from a different kind of point of view. And we've got a bit of an idea in our mind how many applications we think we can handle. And now what we're trying to kind of work out is how do we do that outreach and personalized support and limit the number of applications that then kind of come in so that we can provide that support. So being place-based certainly helps. There's something about trying to support people to different funding opportunities if our funding opportunity isn't relevant. So, having kind of honest conversations with people so that they're not applying for the sake of it, and that, kind of applying whenever they might not properly meet the criteria. But we're also thinking about how we can link and combine people who have the same ideas as well. So that's some stuff around the staffing. And then in the next slide, there was just kind of 3 other areas that I wanted to briefly touch on. And one of them was around budget flexibility. So in one way, being part of a larger funder gave me more flex to move around budgets between funding programs and across years. So this made the grants budget somewhat flexible. But as a smaller funder, we've got more of a fixed budget. So there is less flex within this. And it's kind of trying to kind of work out, the kind of customer journey that we're trying to achieve here, and what is good for a customer journey might actually make our decision making a bit more complex and behind. So an example of this is that we're going to be funding a mixture of developing ideas, so very early stage ideas alongside developed ideas, but we want the ability for some of those developing ideas to secure further funding down the line. So with the peer review sessions, which is, a participatory grant making approach, there will be some money that will have to be kept behind in order to fund that, but we're not being prescriptive around it, and we need to work out in the room, what is the split between those proposals and how much money we keep back. So it's not going to be easy, and Chris and Jill, who are on the call, they might have a bit of a time in their hands trying to support those peer reviewers to decide how to take that forward. So I think the budget, because we're doing it in a very different way, there might be some complexity around the decision making there. In terms of what we fund as well, we want to make sure that there's a good mixture and spread of different ideas. So it's not just that we've got 100 amazing ideas or 100 amazing applications, but what if they're all about the same thing? It doesn't enable us to test out things in the way we want to. So we will leave the door open for some debate at those decision-making meetings as to, what do we fund? Actually, has this worked out? Have we got the types of proposals that we were hoping to in order to test out a theory of change? And I suppose we're not afraid to go, actually, we got it wrong. Something didn't go right here. And, we maybe want to try it again in a different way. We don't necessarily need to award all the funding there and then. And then the final thing was just something that Khadra already picked up on, and it was around the decision making itself and supporting people to be in a place to make good decisions. So we need to enable that we build in time for the peer reviewers to understand, I suppose, what we're trying to achieve. We're bringing together people from very different backgrounds, community members, researchers, public engagement specialists. So they all have to, I suppose, understand collectively what we're trying to achieve. So for me, the other thing about the way in which we're doing this is the resource intensiveness that's required at this particular bit of decision making. And I'm not too sure at the National Lottery Community Fund within my operational budget, I would have always had money to do that, maybe for specific programs, but not across the piece. And I'm going to leave it there.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Yvonne. We're going to do the bit that is a bit of a juggle for me and open it up to questions for anybody who wants to chat or ask anything of Khadra, Coco or Yvonne. This always takes a little bit of time before anybody kind of like manages to type their question or stick their hand up. So I do this awkward thing where I just filler until we do get a question through. So if anybody wants to say something, you're more than welcome to say something now to kick us off, or if not, you can type in the chat. Anybody want to start us off? Perfect. Vasilis, do you want to read yours out? Do you want to say it? I asked you this the other day, didn't I, and just put you on the spot. I can read it if you'd like.
Yes, just a second. I need to adjust my gears here. Sorry. Yeah, here I am. Hi, thank you, Hannah. So yeah, I wanted to ask. I was wondering if the ones receiving the grant form a community among them, and if so, what are the values that bind them as a community? Because participatory grant making is about empowering communities, and it's in the strength of the community to have peer relationships. So I was wondering how this works.
Thank you. Do any of you three want to chip in?
I can start, yeah, on that. So I suppose I can speak to the first bit of that. We will be putting in place a learning program that goes alongside this, and it's going to be very much kind of led by the needs and the wants of the grant holders. So we're putting that kind of structure in place, and because it's place-based as well, we kind of think we've gone to relatively kind of small geographical areas, some apart from the Highlands and Islands in Scotland. So we think we're hoping that there'll be kind of longer lasting relationships that'll be formed as well. But yeah, I think the learning program that'll be quite a bit self-directed, but us providing kind of the resource for that and facilitation for that should really help.
Thanks, Yvonne.
I would say also similarly, we don't want to be at Mama Cash, we don't want to be the barrier for groups to connect with each other. But currently, the grantee partners really go through us. For example, we would fund grantee partners in a certain thematic area in a region to attend conferences when we used to go to conferences together. And so we are looking for other ways from which grantee partners can develop lateral relationships without having to go to Mama Cash as a conduit to that. So yes, we recognize that that's really important. It is more challenging when you are a funder that has such a wide global reach, and we have so many thematic areas that we cover. So that can make it a very time consuming, but it is something that we're cognizant about and thinking about. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Coco. As predicted, we've now got a massive flurry of questions that I can hardly keep up with, so that's very exciting. I'm going to start with Emma. You asked about the biggest resistance to change within an organisation, and I don't know if anybody wants to. From my perspective, I get asked a lot about how do I get my board on board, and that's particularly from more traditional funders who are trying to pivot into participatory grantmaking spaces. So that can be kind of like a really big area of resistance, and one where you sometimes have to question the premise of the question and ask, actually, are you just a bit scared about giving up power rather than having an issue with X, Y, and Z, which is often where when you really dig into it, the root of those kind of challenges come from. I don't know if any of you guys want to kind of chip in with any resistance to change answers.
I don't have anything to add in terms of resistance to change. As I mentioned, our board were on board from the beginning, and it was their idea to use this participatory model. I think one of the things that other boards maybe worry about is risk. At Camden Giving, although we work with local residents to make decisions, our board is still responsible for those decisions. So they don't have an input, but if anything goes wrong, they are still responsible for that decision. And myself and the rest of the team, we also do all the due diligence. So we make sure that we are covering that risk and that it's not just on the local residents. And so far, nothing has gone wrong, so it works. It's not risky. Yeah, thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. We've had one question from Jason around the cost of participatory grantmaking versus traditional grantmaking and what the difference for those things are. I find this question really fascinating because I don't think anybody really talks about the modelling in traditional grantmaking very much. And actually you design funding programs against kind of the budgets and the operations that you've got. And there are some traditional funders who are tiny that have one staff member and a tiny budget, and others that are huge that have massive things. So sometimes this question is really, really difficult because it's not a relation of comparing the two things as like for like. It's often about comparing the size of the organisation and the models that the organisations have, whether that's participatory or traditional. And there are lots of traditional funders that are smaller than Mama Cash and vice versa. Yvonne, I don't know if you've got anything that you can, because you've done both sides of, and Coco actually as well.
Yeah, I would say it's different. You make up your budget differently rather than one being more or less expensive. So you might put your efforts and your resource in different places. So for example, with the Ideas Fund, we were kind of putting resource into day rates for people to be able to kind of participate in the decision making, into development coordinators, etc. Whereas actually traditional grant making probably puts all the resources into full-time staff. So we took away from the full-time staff to kind of push it out in the participatory grant making. So I would say it's made up differently rather than one is more expensive than another.
Yeah, and I would similarly add that it is true for Mama Cash that the period of transitioning is expensive in terms of, besides money, but time and resources to transition or start up a program. But what we have seen with the smaller pots that we have transitioned is that while there is an investment of time and an investment of money, over the subsequent years, we see not only the return on investment in terms of, what we're hearing back from the community, but we see then after some time a more a better equitable balance between the percentage of funding that goes to community versus our operational costs. So over time, we see that it is more cost effective to be transparent. But in the beginning, yes, it is expensive to set up these plans and processes and systems.
Thanks, Coco. We've had one question about software and tech tools. I'm not going to dig into that now because it is a bit logistically, but this was a conversation that cropped up on the Slack group a few days ago. So there was a load of resources on there of people kind of like, going through the different tech tools that you can use around voting and around deliberation and discussion. So I can pick that up afterwards with you if that is helpful. And if you join the community of practice, then you can scroll through the backs of those conversations.
Hannah, Hannah, just to say, I'll pick up with you afterwards because I'm currently working on like full-on kind of grant making systems and how to do it in a participatory kind of way as well. So maybe I'll link into one of your communities of practice and share some information with you.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you. Rowan's asked a question around anybody who's linking with local authorities. So that's government funding and distributing government funding through participatory approaches. Am I right in thinking Camden Giving does some of that stuff?
Yeah, we work very closely with Camden Council. So we've managed a few of their funds that have come through Section 106 agreements. In fact, the first two of our fund programs came from Camden Council. And I think our work with Camden Council was very collaborative. We asked them to join the training sessions and the panel meetings as observers. And as people who can just offer additional information to our panelists, we make sure that they are very aware of the power dynamics that exist in the room. So I think if you are working with local authorities, that's just something to keep in mind. The other thing is sometimes, because we're place-based, the people we work with are residents, and so perhaps their relationship with the council hasn't always been positive, and that's just something else to keep in mind and kind of build relationships. Building relationships is definitely something else we work on a lot.
Thanks, Khadra. Bart, you've got a question that I can't find in my list. I don't know if you want to. Do you want to say it out loud, or do you want me to read it out? I can't. There you are, Bart. Hello.
Sure. Yeah. Hi there. Hi, everybody. So I work for the New England Grassroots Environment Fund, and we're a participatory funder as well, focused on environmental justice. And in operationalizing that over the last few years, what's coming up more and more as we're centering equity, talk about white supremacy culture, implicit bias, etc., within our participants is just the notion of trauma. And how do you create spaces as folks are participating, as you operationalize all these concepts? How do you create support for participants, especially in multi-race, multi-ethnic groups that come at it from different levels of understanding of systemic oppression? How do you create that kind of support?
Thanks, Bart. Does anybody want to kick us off?
I'm happy to say a bit. So and we haven't, the Ideas Fund is just launched, but actually one of our locations is Derry and Strabane in Northern Ireland. And in Northern Ireland, similar issues, but different in terms of sectarianism and I suppose kind of the troubles from the last how many ever years. And I think specifically, it's got a mental health and well-being focus to the actual fund itself, and therefore there's no, and there's significant rates of kind of suicide and all sorts of things that relate back to the troubles. So I would imagine a lot of this stuff that people, it's about, if it's about public engagement and health research around mental health, a lot of stuff is going to be trauma related. There's no doubt about it. And I think, that one of the reasons the place-based approach for us will help in this particular situation is that we've got these development coordinators on the ground who know these communities inside out and can try and kind of understand and I think foresee some of the stuff that'll come up and things that we might need to put in place. So we haven't got to the stage yet because we've literally just launched the fund of doing that outreach work, but that I would envisage through, especially with the development coordinators and that kind of support that I talked about, that kind of coaching, the kind of the facilitative kind of support that they can access, I think will really help them collectively think through how they address some things like this that might come up. There might be different issues, similar but different issues in the other areas as well.
I would just add similarly, although we are sort of right now launching our inaugural community advisory panel, one of the things that because we have heard about these type of issues, and one of the things that we're going to try to test is that we are going to, along with all of the community panel members receiving their stipend, we're giving the community advisory committee itself funding that they themselves can choose to use for facilitated dialogue, if they feel like they want to get outside consultancy help, if they feel like they want to direct the money towards learning. So they will control as a body how funding, how a certain segment of the funding is spent to figuring out how to create a sustainable body of itself that is sustainable beyond their tenures. And maybe they will be able to give us recommendations about how we can support them better through these processes as well. So
One of the things that we did when we were doing the Leaders with Lived Experience programme at the National Artery Community Fund, which is what you find is often people who experience trauma are rolled out by funders to talk about the worst things that ever happened to them on a stage to make funders feel bad and hopefully give them money. And that's a shitty dynamic that shouldn't exist. And part of the way that we designed the Leaders with Lived Experience programme is that we worked with leaders in that field to stand up at the beginning of sessions and say, I'm a lived experience leader and you don't get to know about my trauma. I'm not talking about it and neither do you. And that's setting the tone from somebody from those communities rather than a funder saying, oh, you don't need to tell us that, when ultimately every interaction that they've ever had with a funder has involved them telling some form of trauma in whatever way a funder decides that it needs to be, 500 words on a page or, you know, in front of a room full of 200 people. So having that categorically said and modelled by somebody who's a lived experience leader was a really, really good way to kind of move away from like the X Factor sub stories that people get forced into sharing through this process. Khadra, go on.
Yeah, I think for me as well, related to that, it goes back to resourcing. So if you're planning a program where you're working with people with lived experience, have you taken into account that additional support that people need? So at Camden Giving, we're working on our anti-racism strategy, and we recognise that in order to do that work, we can't just rely on the staff's skills and knowledge. And so we're working with an external facilitator to support that piece of work alongside the other work of, you know, how to read application forms and what is funding and all that kind of stuff.
That's Khadra. And I think this stuff is really, really important because wherever you're getting funding, so funders, if you are putting this into your operational budgets, then that shouldn't be the first thing that goes when it gets tight. But also for a lot of the organisations that are participatory grant making, so Camden Giving, Mama Cash, receive funding from other organisations. They are onward granting organisations. So if you're a funder who is funding participatory grant making, you should be building that support into the grants that you're passing on to participatory grant making organisations. Don't question it when they've got it in their budget lines. I am going to go to, there's a question about when panelists disagree, which is always a question to kind of get into. What happens when you get conflict on a panel and they can't come to a conclusion? How on earth do you cope with that? Coco's smiling like, I know.
I just think it's the same as it happens with our staff. I think sometimes folks turn around and they say, oh, going participatory and working with community is messy, but you know, I think community is made out of people just like our funding agencies. And, you know, sometimes I would have to say that sometimes when we are doing a decision making, we always sort of plan for 2 days or, you know, a certain amount of time, but we always keep in mind that we need to increase that because there are always times when folks have friendly disagreements and not so friendly disagreements, and you know, it sometimes takes time to work out. And yeah, and it's the same thing with our program officers as well. You know, it's very, some of these decisions, as I mentioned with Mama Cash, basically 1.5% of the grants the applicants get funded. So it's a very competitive process. So obviously it's very, very hard to make these decisions. There's so many much more need and then we can actually fund. And so I understand that dynamic, and it's just a human issue, not a participatory grant making problem.
Thanks, Coco. Katie Love has put in the chat that gradients of agreement tool is a really good way of moving from a binary yes and no to a spectrum, which might help. And I think lots of other people, when you're doing participatory grant making, part of the beginning is you're not, is the collectives agreeing that you're there to make a collective decision. You're not coming into a room to fight for the thing that you want. And once you've got a collective of people agreeing that the outcome is a collective decision rather than your thing, you can always return to back to that point, which kind of can sometimes help alleviate some of the conflict that can arise. But conflict is good and disagreement is really healthy, and we've got to a place in the world where it's not, and that's caused all sorts of trouble. So we should embrace this and embed it into our structures, because it genuinely will make the world a better place if we can get to a point where we can discuss and still like each other at the end of it. Khadra, I don't know if you were about to come in and
add to that as well. Before you even reach the stage of conflict, I think it's really important to create safe spaces and give people the tools to be able to communicate in a way that's like consensus based. And also what is really important is building relationships. because when you build relationships, then you build trust, and then people are able to confidently disagree with one another. I think the worst case scenario is if people feel unheard, and that's when it gets into a negative conflict space. So I think building those relationships and allowing people the space for disagreements is really important.
Thanks, Khadra. Solimain, I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly, but do you want to talk about your question? I wasn't sure I quite understood what you typed. If you are there.
Yeah, just a sec. One thing is when first of all, thank you for this sharing and presentation. So I raised that issue because when I was first confronted with our pilot grant making, at first I saw that because we are right-based oriented, and those who had been selected by the panels varied from girls trying to do craft that is very often reserved to men. So I can see the rationale is to empower girls and also to break the silo in terms of occupation. But one aspect was a group of young and youth groups working on farming. So, and my question was, what we are mostly supporting initiatives on children's right protection, and here we are like funding something that has a lucrative aspect. So this brought me to ask these questions, whether as an organization we can just come and say you can reflect on any kind of topic, any kind of issue you want to work with, but it will be how can I say it, secluded, or it would be in the brackets of a set thematics, or either it is the way that they propose their approach that is much more interesting. Like we most of the time support community approach rather than trying to do other costly initiatives like advocacy with state authorities and so, because we have seen the limits. And we have seen that community ownership is much more important. But yeah, the issue is, can we as a donor and also working with the panel just impose, how can I say it, an array of activities where the panel has to decide who will benefit from the support. I don't know whether I was clear on what I'm saying.
No, that's great. I've got it. I don't know if any of you guys want to chip in about that, kind of like I suppose the who sets the direction.
Maybe I just would like to precise that I'm working as a child rights consultant with the Fund for Global Human Rights, and I'm based in Dakar, Senegal.
Thank you.
So I'm not too sure if it's specific kind of what you're asking, but it strikes me that there's something about what is it you're trying to get out of your funding program that will kind of dictate, I suppose, if you want to award grants based on kind of the theme or based on what the potential benefits for those people who might be involved in it are. So for example, within the Theory of Change for the Ideas Fund, an actual change we want to see is around connections between researchers and communities. And actually, the idea might not work out great. It might not actually be a really strong kind of project in terms of a brand new approach or an innovative approach to public engagement. But actually, the potential of that project to connect the researcher and the community members to work more closely together and something that could be kind of longer lasting beyond this project might actually be beneficial enough for us to award. And the potential of that might be more beneficial. Might be might give us cause for awarding it, even if the actual idea we think might not work out itself. So I'm not too sure if that's what you were getting at. But yeah, but that's only because we've set up the funding program in that way, that actually part of what we're trying to achieve through the funding program is the connections between those people who get funded.
I think there's also something to be said around participatory grant making being a spectrum, and like participation can come into the process at lots of different points. It can be in decision making, and that's great, but you can also embed it into kind of your strategies of developing what should a funding program be, who controls what that narrative is that a funder or a donor saying this is what I want to do, or is it about community saying this is what is important to me and this is what you can fund? So there's different points in which you can bring in participation into the whole kind of philanthropic kind of cycle of grant making, rather than just at that kind of end point of decision making. And it might be that that's at the point that communities can come together and decide actually what is important. Is it an issue? Is it a topic? Is it a place? Is it a process? What are we looking to fund? Coco, there is one question directed at you particularly around working in several countries, but British Science Association is also across kind of like different countries in the UK. Do you have different peer decision-making committees for each country, or do you kind of, how do you split it up? Do you split it up, or is it free for all for everyone, or themes, or what does that look like?
No, actually, so it's going to be all one pot, although the first review from the community committee will be based upon region and language, but then the full committee will be discussing the finalist applications. We're going to attempt to do that, for better or for worse. So yes, it's not going to be different thematic or different regional advisory committees. There'll be just one.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to see whether there is any other kind of final questions that we can land on, but I've actually just looked at the time and it's 2 minutes to, so I imagine that if we get into anything, it might be a bit late. I'll have a look through the questions, and if there is anything that I've missed, then we can kind of pick that up in other conversations. The Slack group and the community of practice is always after kind of unpicking some of the big questions that you've asked. I think one of the biggest one is what issues do boards have with giving up power, which is, to be honest, an entire day's worth of conversation that I'm more than happy to have with someone if they want it. But we can definitely pick that up. And there was I'll share in the follow-up sessions after this, there's a blog that I wrote around getting boards on board that kind of unpicks some of that in a bit more detail. So we have come to the end of this session and the rest of the learning sessions, which is very exciting. Thank you so much for everybody for being involved. Coco, Khadra and Yvonne, it's been so lovely to see you and chat through and get into kind of the nuts and bolts of it all, because ultimately, like, this is where most of the questions always come, is how do we do it? We want to do it, but it's really hard. So the conversation, I think, will continue through the community of practice. That's what it's there for, to help you kind of work out how this can work in your own organisation. So please do join in. Connor, thanks for your kind of like sneaky tech help so that I don't lose it trying to add everybody into the meeting. That's always very appreciated. Have a lovely rest of the day. It is Friday tomorrow, and then is the weekend. So good luck and enjoy, and I will see you all soon. Bye.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you.